this segment, we're going to introduce another sabaki, another principle of movement, and we're going to address it as attack, counterattack. The reason we're going to do that is basically it's a half of a sabaki, or a half of a body entering movement. And it usually only happens because you've been jammed out and you're unable to complete the initial movement. And from that position, you've got to be able to counterattack what you're dealing with. So first, I'd like to just disclose the actual sabaki, and it's very basic and very easy to understand. With the body movement is from your basic triangular stance, you're either rotating forward or backwards on your front leg. Rotating forward, you can rotate any number of degrees. Right now I'm using the square principle. If you imagined a box on the ground, I'm rotating 2 corners on that box. This movement can also be done in degrees of 180 degrees, quarter turns, and backwards. Backwards 180 degrees, backwards quarter turn, forward quarter turn. Typically with this entry movement, there's a small slide step into place, so that I'm going to move this foot forward, and as soon as it lands, I'm going to begin my rotation. When you enter with this movement, usually entering with an ikkyo, so that both hands are coming up like this, bottom hand coming up as the strike or catch, and top hand as the sweeper or clearer. So then your entry would look like this. Now we're going to use our partner Joe. We're going to demonstrate the basic principle in combat, the way it should generally happen. We're going to do it with a number of variations. By that, we're saying that you don't always enter the same way twice, and your opponent's reaction is not going to be consistent. But there's only a finite number of moves he can do, and we're going to capitalize on those. So basically, from a fighting position, it should be noted that when you're this close, this position is good. But in Aiki, when you make enough distance, you can keep your hands down. As soon as you begin to enter in, your hands have to come up into an ikkyo. If not, you're going to get hit, maybe knocked out. It's very bad. Okay, I'm going to enter with an ikkyo, but first I want to demonstrate the goal of this rotating entry is to rotate once on the side and then once to this side. So that if this is the entry done in the air, this should be the entry done on the opponent. Now you can see that it's mechanically rather sound. The goal, or the intended focus of the sabaki, the body movement, should be a full circle around, so that when I enter, I'm first going to enter and land on this side, then I'm going to pass to this side, and should he disengage completely, I'll come all the way back around. So with an ikkyo entry, to this way, to this way, to this way, and to this way. When you enter, though, you're going to enter deep with the intention of butting your hips against his if you can. So then, the first technique that we're going to use is hip throw. Hip throw is best used because it's at first a body entering technique. If you get it off, you get what you want. If you don't get it off, his ability to step around the hip throw gives you the counters that you're going to use, so that I miss the hip throw, I'm usually in a third control or a 4 directions throw or something. So first we're going to do the basic hip throw. Should think of this hip throw like in judo ukigoshi, which is more of a twisting hip throw rather than a lifting, throwing hip throw. Now, I'm entering on my opponent. I intend to throw, but he's going to block out. Typically, especially good wrestlers, will tend to be able to get out of a hip throw either by sinking or jumping around the hip throw. In this case, he's going to jump around. Taking third control. Again. Sometimes your entry is first control entry. Sometimes you're not getting first control, or upon entry you're winding up like this. Now I have his rear hand. If I throw him and he steps around, this hand, instead of being a third control entry, will be a four directions entry. It's the same body movement on my part. It only varies because I wasn't able to get this hand. So as I entered through, I got this hand. Consistently, the counters for blocked submissions and joint locks are the same. They don't vary too much because the human body, only having 2 arms and 2 legs, there's only so many things you can do with it. So I'm showing you basically an attack to a counter to a counter. And if you learn them in that order, it's very logical so that you won't be stuck. You learn the technique and you go in and it doesn't work and you say, well, what do I do now? Well, we're showing you, we're planning on it not working, so that by the time you get there and it doesn't work that way, you're going to add and then add until eventually you have to get something. So the first 2 we did was more commonly in the type of fighting that people tend to compete in today. NHB has a very consistent form that you're dealing with. Most consistent is body clinch. So these are a couple of renditions that happen from body clinch. As I enter with my first control, tend to ignore the hand contact or withdraw to a body clinch. Like this, body clinch. From this position, it's very common grip in wrestling. This is called wizard grip. From this position first, just to apply hip throw. Sometimes from the hip throw, again, people will launch out to come around the hip throw. When they do, sacrifice throw is good Aiki move. Aiki, remember, is just the riding of someone's resistance. So sometimes it's good to go in and intend to fail a first throw, just so that you can get the second. Sometimes on entry of the clinch, Instead of being overhooked in a wizard grip, you get underhook. At this time, simple arm throw. Arm throw can be done with just a turning of the body and to take the opponent around. Another popular entry throw in Aikido is done, it's called side entry throw. It looks like entry throw cut with this way, but cut with the arm going backwards and usually to the side of your opponent. So it happens most successfully when your opponent is forced for a moment forward and then is forced to stand up out of it. And when he commits to standing up out of it, you throw him in that direction. So for right now, from this position, he's down and he's trying to stand up. When you do this, it's true that you're blocking your opponent's hips with your leg, but you're not necessarily tripping him over your leg. It's true that you're cutting him over like this, but in some cases, because an opponent has good balance or power, you cut like this, but with the intention of fully landing in a position that looks like this. I have to explain this a little bit, and this is where the phenomenon or the belief of ki is. It's not that it's a mystical force, but it's your tendons and ligaments spiral out of your body, so that you have to be able to roll them in a direction until they've reached their end, and when they've reached their end, you need to be able to reverse the direction. This throw is a good example of that, in that I'm going to cut him this way, and now I can't rotate my hand anymore this way, so I'm just simply going to reverse the direction. You cut this throw with the intention of winding up in this position. Very bad for the opponent. Another in this repertoire is called elbow throw or hijinage. Elbow throw depends on the same mechanics as the cutting arm and entering throw. So we're back to the shape of my arm is a coiled, very gently shaped U, but we're going to apply it to another part of the body, and it's going to be his elbow. I'm going to roll the arm over just like an entering throw to the head and neck, except I'm going to use his arm and the pressure of his arm not to cause pain, but to lead him into the ground. Sometimes it throws him over, sometimes it pins him flat. It depends on his reaction to you. I'm going to enter with Ikkyo and rotate. From this position, I'm just holding long enough to secure. You can make a large grand loop. You can just shoot your hand through, just so long as that when the inside of your elbow contacts the upper part just above his elbow, it's in that shape. And when it contacts, you can make a small gesture like this to make pressure against it. Once you make the pressure in, roll the hand over. Don't just roll it over like this, but in fact roll it over and aim it right into the ground as if you were going to take a forward roll, go that close to the ground. When you do that, if I do just this and roll it over, he'll move, but it won't down him. Needs to come from this position. My hand rolls over, very close to the ground. Sometimes when applying this, you don't down your opponent, but much like in the Ikkyo phenomenon, where we're able to recounter into another throw, sometimes just the ability to throw him away will wind you back up so that you can enter in and re-enter. And again, the neutralizations tend to go in order and they don't really deviate that much. Okay. Now I'd like to discuss the phenomenon of Aiki and some conditioning relating to the phenomenon. Aiki has within it a belief in the internal energy. The internal energy is not some mystical force that does favors for you when you pray to it, but it's the proper use of your body's innermost strength, which resides in your tendons, not your muscles. And the way that you use your tendons is directly related to the way they're actually attached to your body. Your tendons and your ligaments actually spiral around your body. So what you have for natural movement that derives power are movements such as, this is Aiki Age. The exercise of Aiki Age and Sage is an exercise of rotation, using your tendons in your body the proper way. For Aiki Age, I'm going to rotate with my thumb as the focal point so that when I rotate my hand up, like as if raising a sword, this will be the immovable point and everything else goes around. When I rotate down, my pinky becomes the immovable point and like so. So when you're raising a sword, in reality, you're raising it like this, much to do with the wrists. And when you bring down for cut, also much to do with the wrists. There are many forms of what's called kokyu-ho, or breath power training. What that does is unifies the maximum amount of breath you can take in, much like if you lift weights. When you lift weights, if you have heavy weight, it's impossible to lift it even off the bench without first taking a deep breath and then begin the exertion and the exhale at the same time. So for a technique of kokyu-ho, I'm going to off-balance my opponent, who will grab firmly. And to show this static is not so easy, because it should be done in a full fluid movement. But we're going to show it static, then we'll do it fluent. I'm going to do Aiki Age, which is up. Now I have his resistance into me. When I reverse the motion, I'm going to sink under his center because I'm floating him over me. So I'm actually going to pass under him while he passes over me. In one move, keep strong. Another form of kokyu-ho, or breath power technique, involves 2-on-1 grab. He's going to grab my hand with both his hands. When he does, I'm going to perform a basic body maneuver. I'm just going to do a half a turn. I'm going to raise my hand in the same manner that I described, as though I'm raising a sword. He's going to keep his grasp on my hand. If he lets go, the exercise is dead. The reason for this exercise is to develop that sensitivity to be able to maneuver your opponent just on the touch. Rather than grabbing and pushing and pulling, just your basic touch should be enough to maneuver your opponent like so. This is a throwing technique. You hold good. Better. If my opponent releases his grasp in the middle of the exercise will go dead. But his job is to hold on until absolutely necessary that he take ukemi. If I don't throw right, he won't be thrown properly. He won't turn over in the air. The object of the throw is to lead him down and around. This type of sensitivity training is very important. Even in judo, where you see such techniques as a simple shoulder throw, you don't simply load a person up onto you to throw him. you have to have a moment where you float him. So in floating him up, I'm also sinking myself under. This affects the throw without a great deal of power, but if I tried to just pull him to me and throw him over my back, at some point I'm going to have to use an amount of muscular force, and if he's too big, I don't have it. These techniques are floating techniques. What they're allowing you to do is to feel your partner's center going high, while you in turn are sinking your center under. Usually at the point where your centers pass each other, that's a point of critical mass, where he's most susceptible to being thrown or pinned. So when you're practicing these techniques, although no one is ever going to grab you like this, it's definitely feasible that you can apply even the same technique from grasping your opponent, whereas right now he's grasping me and making this possible. It's also true that to throw an opponent in any way, to float him, you can grab him by the gi, or you can lead him around. Elbow throw is a good example. At this point, I'm floating him in the throw, but when I go to throw, he's got to sink. So he's float and sink. These drills and these exercises simply heighten your sensitivity to that, and they also teach you to preserve your form, so that simply by being in contact with your opponent, you begin to maneuver him and float him. Floating doesn't only consist up and down, it's also forward and back. I give you a good example about that is right now he's standing and stable. Right now I'm sinking him by putting the pressure as I am down and through his legs. He has to resist up. So right now he's feeling me bringing him down, and if he allows me to, he'll simply fall to the floor. So there's a moment where I'm going to release this, and when I do, I'm going to release it in a very round motion, up and around. So when I release, up and around, easy to take him down. From a distance, looks like nothing. But if I just try to cut him and he resists, like this, now without the cutting hand, I'd like to add to the rotating entry a variation that puts you in relatively the same situation, but it has a couple of add-ons with regard to power. It also has a couple of advantages with regard to speed. That's the twisting entry, or cross-legged entry. It's similar to cross-legged stances you find in Kung Fu and Karate, but we have a very simple form with which to perform the actual sabaki itself. If I use the plus sign in the tatamis as my reference, and I start my front foot off on the plus sign and my rear foot just a little bit back, I'm going to slide my foot as far to the right as I can, much like a slide, like this. This foot going that way, this foot's going, my rear foot's going to come up the middle, so like this and like this. So it should be an equal stance change. If the opponent were there, I'd be hitting him this way. If the opponent were there, now I'd be hitting him this way. This is very good for if you're already clinched, just to make power. This is very good for entry into any kind of throw, and it also has a couple of attending strikes that are very forceful, very powerful. So right now we're going to use Joe. Okay, in fighting position. First, I'm going to demonstrate a principle about striking, which is pantomime of the body. Pantomime of the body, in this case, we're referring to the ability of your hands and your feet to keep perfect time with one another. So that rather than I'm bouncing around and throwing a hard punch, every step I take has an attendant block or strike, and I don't deviate from that in some capacity. So that in every way when I move, every part of my body, when it touches another part of my opponent, has attending power. As mentioned on the plus sign, I'm going to time my hands and my feet. I'm going to time them to make a gambit where I hit him with this hand, but it involves a couple of moves beforehand with my feet and my lead hand. So first is my right foot is going to slide offline. My right foot offline, my left foot up the line. Now, my right foot off the line, my right hand up, and my left foot going up the line. It's confusing at first, but if you watch it as a dance, it has some form to it. Okay. My next step off the line is going to be directly behind my opponent, and when this foot lands there, this hand or arm is going to cut here. Very slowly, I'm just going to butt into him. When you enter, if at a distance or if your opponent makes distance, it's sufficient to use palm heel, and you may not get the down, but you'll get a very extremely forceful strike. I've knocked out a number of people with it, and I've cut a number of people with it in open competition in Japan. It's very effective, but in practice, very dangerous. When you're doing it, you want to time it at first till you get used to it. Make it a body blow. So it's good to do like this. When you're sure of it, when you really have to put somebody out, aim it across the neck and try to aim so that this hand will cut down at the same time this hand will strike, and then this hand is coming around, not going out and in, but next application of a cross-legged or twisting entry is to butt hips. To butt hips is usually a process of like doing a hockey check. If you imagine skaters in hockey and they're trying to hit with the hip to come up underneath, imagine you have small horns sticking out and you're going to do this and stick your opponent to you. Usually with this technique you have two options. One is going to be you're going to take a first control, depending on the side your hands are on, or you're going to re-enter back in for hip throw. Either case, it's about the same as when you do it with rotating entry, except that it's much more on the spot. It's much more applicable to, I'm in a position and my opponent rushed me, like this. If you see my hips, how low they are and locked into him, the only thing holding me up right now is my opponent. If he were to suddenly withdraw, which he wouldn't because I'm doing it as a defense, I would probably fall over. But to look at my stance the way it really is, I'm actually on a very big crosshair, the intersection being about there. So that when I do this to my opponent, my hips and his hips now being locked, is I have a great ability to overtake his balance, even with just my next step. In this position, I don't necessarily want to try to attack him with this, although you can. If the technique was done before, we explained it on the plus, to slide this foot down and slide this foot up, to be able to attack or invade his center with it, I'm going to do the same thing, but instead of going across, I'm going to take this foot and go up, back towards first base, like this, sliding in. In this position, I can slide in like this and then enter around for hip throw, or I can slide in like this, and if both my hands are on this side, I can take any number of the throws that we have described. To do the twisting entry, once your hips butt, you'll have either usually a chance at taking a first control, a side entering throw, or a hip throw, just like in the other entries, like rotating entry. But it'll be from a different perspective because of the forces involved. You'll be hitting in a different way. First, I'm going to enter. Right now, I'm entered. If a punch is to come into my head, it's good to take first control. If I'm in a clinch after this point of entry, I can take a hip throw. From this position, in this position, this would be a first control, or side entering throw. In this position, simply hip throw. Competition, you're not getting techniques off the way that you're getting them in practice. When you learn them in practice, generally as soon as you start your technique, you're assured that in the end you're going to get that same technique off. In practice, usually your opponent senses you're up to something. Sometimes he's not trying to fight with real intensity. He's trying more to see what you've got and then just back out, see if he can just block you out and not allow you to get a throw. Oftentimes in competition, fighters are content to take a punch and then back out of a throw simply to deprive you of a throw. This is a kind of sick mentality that happens in competition, but it's a reality. There's something that you can do with regard to each sabaki or body movement that you use as an entry to compensate for that. And so I'm going to show you one with regard to rotating entry. Rotating entry, usually when you're doing it, your opponent, if he sees it coming and wants to back away, he'll negate whatever it is you're doing. So I'm going to enter deep and Joey's just going to move away. Right now I'm too far. If I were to try to do anything from here, I'd just get punched. We're going to invent a field. I'm going to traverse the field based on usually two lines. I'm going to do a rotating entry on this line, and then when it goes bad, I'm going to switch to that line. The lines don't have to be necessarily this far apart, but you'll see what I mean when I do it. I'm going to land right on this line and he's going to move away. From this position, I'm going to cross from this line to that line and rotating entry. See what I've done? Okay. Every time I step and enter, he's going to move away, and I'm just going to follow him gently up the room like dancing. So I'm stepping and entering, stepping and entering, stepping and entering. This is an excellent way to close your opponent's options off. Basically, like in boxing, they would say cut off the ring. If I were just stepping and entering and then he moved and then stepping and entering and he moved, I would more like chasing a rabbit. In this case now, I can cut the ring off. I'm stepping and entering, I'm stepping and entering, I'm stepping and entering. If your opponent's perceptive and he withdraws and advances, it's very simple. I'm stepping and entering, he's coming, I'm keeping this point. Keeping this point is very important because now if I just step and enter, I'm plenty close. So he's moving away, he's coming back, I'm keeping that point. Very good, like that. Most people, if they learn some form of rotary throw, usually they only learn that part of the throw, so what winds up happening is I step and enter, he moves away, I don't know another step, so I'm stuck here, I'm waiting, which is also the reason that you need to know all of your throws and all of your entries, one from your left side, one from your right, so that at any point in time, in any direction, you can do any entry. If I do a cross-legged entry from here and he begins to move away, I can step across and do a turning entry. So long as you're able to do left to right, right to left, you don't have to worry about, oops, I started something and he ran away. You'll always have something to do to follow him up. And likewise, most of the entries that you do forward, you should be able to do them backwards or some variation of, just to keep in time with your opponent. So he's moving away, he's moving away, he's moving away, like that. or sabaki. It's the most traditional, actually. It's usually the first one learned in Aikido, but it's learned in a very flaccid form. It's to teach proper body movement, but this sabaki, when in a fight, in a confrontation, should also be used to establish your ring generalship. So I'm going to demonstrate the sabaki first, just as a means of movement. Then I'm going to teach it as it's traditionally done, briefly. Then I'm going to show it in general context in combat. The basic sabaki is from your hanmi, or basic T stance. It involves one reverse pivot, one back step, then from the other side, reverse pivot and back step. These are the same moves that many Western boxers use. Wrestlers use them with regard to shuck and jive, things that allow your opponent to come up on you and they believe they have you grounded on a line, and you redirect them off the line. Now they've gone that way, and you're free to counter. When we learn it in a traditional form, we first learn it like this, both hands. We first learn it as this, as a throw or a pin, one turn and throw. This is just an exercise to stabilize yourself. When you practice in a confrontation, you want to practice slide step plus enter and turn step plus tai no henka, as this is called, which is just pivot and turn. And you want to be able to do them fluidly from one to the other. In fighting, if he just is attack and I'm not prepared, coming, and, okay. From the same footwork we were just doing. If I wasn't confident that I could take the grab or the technique, it wouldn't have to be a wrist catch. It could be as soon as he came, I could take his collar, or it could be that I'm not sure of what he's doing. Just the ability to be able to, and wait, and coming in. Just as a form of ring generalship to keep yourself safe, rather than standing on the line and waiting for a technique to come. I hope you enjoyed this last segment. We're getting deeper into the competitive theory and the ways in which we're able to apply this in real combat. In the next volume, next 2 volumes actually, we'll have to deal with something that many people in Aikido are even hesitant to tackle, and that is groundwork. So I look forward to seeing you in the next series, and we will make more of a complete system for Aikido people, and this should help us along the way. With something like Aikido, it's not a specific technique. Aiki is simply riding your opponent's force. And so you could do Aikido with boxing. In fact, if you ask me, Roy Jones is as good an Aikido practitioner as any Aikido master. Most techniques are absorbed from a weapon. Judo is Aikido. Most techniques are based or taken from the sword or the spear. Tennis is Aikido. Aikido means that I'm harmonizing with you. Basically, I'm trying to solicit a response from you, and when I get that response, I'm going to steer that response into a favorable position. And that's Aiki. It's not the particular technique, it's what you're doing with the opponent's energy.
How did you first get interested in the martial arts?
I first got interested in martial arts when I was a very small boy. I actually remember hearing on TV about the death of Bruce Lee, and I must have been 3 or 4. And somehow that struck me, that stuck with me. And then anytime I ever saw anything related to martial arts, it was just one of those things born in you. When I was a kid, and when I was in my early 20s, I think like a lot of people, I was astounded by the speed of Bruce Lee. If you catch the right footage, you can see a human being that could literally move faster than the eye could see. So that was a phenomenon, and I think a lot of us were chasing that phenomenon. And as time went on, I started to see other things, and I started to see things differently. And you know, all the time you're trying to simplify what you do and quantify it, and that's really what gravitated me towards the Aikido as a martial art, because the cue and the structure of the cue is very simple and easier to assimilate into your structure. If you can't immerse yourself to a degree in it, it's not worth it even to participate. I mean, if you're looking at it to look and say, wow, that's really cool and I like watching these tapes, that's one thing. But if you're not prepared to immerse yourself into it and really think of it almost as a religion, and the reason for that is because in this practice your life depends on it, and if you don't take it that serious, somebody will get hurt, and it's not worth it for that, for fun.
Have you tried using specific moves of Aikido in combat?
Yes, I have in fact. A number of the things that you see on these tapes, like escaping a choke with a third control technique, I've done it. Entering throw, I've done it. And a lot of these techniques I've done in fights that I lost. I've done entering throws in fights that I lost, but I got the entering throw off. I've had over 50 fights in Japan alone. I mean, I've been fighting all my life, and if you actually had to count how many professional fights I've had, that's including going into people's dojos and picking fights, it's a lot more than 50. If I counted on my hands the number of fighters that I have worked with who have gone on to become champion of this and champion of that, these are guys who have never been able to tap me in a dojo, and I've tapped them hundreds of times, thousands of times. And a lot of fighters try to compete with that by saying, let's say they embellish their records or their careers or what they've done. And I hear it from guys that I've trained and taught, and I get no acknowledgement of being the guy who trained them or taught them or even helped them. And a lot of guys are turning around and trying to pretend like You know, they're my teacher. I'm old. There are guys who have held a lot more titles than me. I've been doing this a lot more years than they have. So what I say with a great deal of experience. I was actually the first ultimate fighter to ever fight Royce Gracie, because I fought him in his dojo before the UFC ever existed. I'd been in Los Angeles for a while, and I needed money, and I had just heard about them. A friend of mine had told me about them, and I called him up and I asked him, is it true? And he said, yeah. And a story I like to tell is aside from the fact that none of us in professional fighting would have jobs if it wasn't for Roy and Gracie, but I called him up and I bet. He said, you can bet if you want. And so I said, I'll bet. I said, I bet you $600. And he said, okay. And it was slated to be about 2 weeks later, and then about the day before the fight, he called me up and he said, let's forget the bet. So in my head, I'm thinking, oh, the guy must be afraid. But I get to the fight, and we fight in the dojo, and I lose. And then after the fight, he said, well, look at it this way. He says, you won $600. And I asked him, I said, how come you canceled that bet? And he said, $500 is a bet. He said, $1,000 is a bet, but $600 is rent. And so I could kind of tell he'd been there at some point. He'd been out on his luck, and I appreciated that. And not to mention, I appreciated the fact that we all had good jobs for a long time because of UFC and everything he did. Originally, before I fought Royce Gracie in his dojo, I moved to Los Angeles to answer a challenge that Steven Seagal made in Black Belt magazine. He said that anybody who wanted to fight him could go to his dojo and challenge him and be prepared to fight to the death. So I went with a written challenge, and I went every day, morning and night, even through the Los Angeles riots, and I waited, and he never came. But, you know, that's the kind of crazy things you do when you're a kid. In my view, all styles amount to the same thing. I think all styles, if you go to Southeast Asia, to Burma, you go to Thailand, all the old masters are practicing some soft form, usually a two-sword form or a spear form. Looks very much like Tai Chi. Tai Chi is the Chinese version of Aiki, and they all have the same ending form. Varies, but it's basically the same in the end. Aiki in any sport is based on your mastery of it, and that's all it is.